All right. Well, and with that, I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Bill Fosher. Bill is the lead conservation planner with the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Districts, and he will talk to us tonight about frost and trample seeding. So Bill has a farm at home and he raises about 50 lambs every year, and he has also a very strong background in vegetation management. He used to run a flock of about 1,000 ewes for vegetation management. And yeah, welcome, Bill. And you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. See if I can share the right one on the first try this time. How did that work?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. All right, thanks for encouraging my behavior. Frost seeding and trample seeding I really kind of just treat the two as the same sort of thing. They're both ways of putting seed into the ground with minimal soil disturbance. And, so you're gonna probably not see the word trample seeding much after this title slide here, but that, anything I'm saying about frost seeding applies equally to trample seeding. And I guess the biggest difference is that you don't have the timing of trample seeding isn't quite as crucial as frost seeding, but we'll get into that in a minute. Both frost and trample seeding work best with legume seed. So clovers, bird's foot trefoil, maybe alfalfa, probably not. It doesn't seem to, it's a little bit of a princess and doesn't often like to, get its seed that cold. The timing of frost seeding, as I mentioned, is really important. You want to have your seed on the ground when the frost is coming out of the soil. So late winter, early spring. What's going on at that point is that the frost is heaving like it does in our roads. It creates an upward and downward motion in the soil, and that creates little tiny cracks that the clover seed can fall down into. And that's why the legume seeds tend to work so well in this system, because they're nice little tight spheres. They don't have hairs like grass seed does, and they'll work their way down into those cracks that open up every day in the soil, and they'll get good seed to soil contact, which is crucial for any seed that's trying to germinate. Species, I just talked about using legumes rather than grasses. The seeding rate for your legumes is going to be a little bit higher than what they suggest on the bag, because you're going to lose some of this seed. It's not all going to work. And how much you have to increase that is going to depend on a few different things that we'll get into a little bit later. Your soil texture is going to have a big effect on your on your success. Heavier soils like silt loams, clay loams tend to move more as the frost moves through them than a sandy soil. So you'll get better seed to soil contact in those heavier clay and silt loams than you will in a sandy loam or a loamy sand. Soil fertility is, you don't get away with not paying attention to soil fertility just because you're frost seeding. You still need to pay attention to it. And that means that you really almost always have to address your soil pH. That's almost in every pasture system that I've seen, that's been the first thing that needs attention. And of course, to know that, you need to have a soil test done. If you haven't had a soil test done within the last 3 or so years, probably can't really do it right now. I'm not sure where everybody is located, but certainly throughout the Northeast, the soil's pretty well frozen by now. But you still could go ahead and do frost seeding, and then possibly put on the amendments that are needed later. There's a story I like to tell about the lady that wanted to grow chickens in her backyard, and she went to her conservation district and said, I've been trying to raise chickens in my backyard for years now, and I planted the eggs pointy side down, I planted them pointy side up, planted them in the spring, I planted them in the fall. Nothing ever comes up. I don't have any chickens at all. And the agronomist says, well, you really have to start with a soil test. And it's kind of everything starts from this piece of information. You can get them from private labs, you can get them from land grant universities. This is one that I pulled on one of my pastures. I used UMass. They're actually closer to me than the University of New Hampshire, the part of the state I live in. And the turnaround time at that point for UNH was running several months, and in UMass it was just a few weeks. So I wanted to get going on this, and this is what the soil test results look like. I don't know if you guys can read this, but if you look at this pH value here on my pasture when I started out, it was 5.2, which is really acidic. And the reason that matters so much is that plants can't take up all of these nutrients very well until you get into a fairly neutral pH, like somewhere between 6.2 and 6.5, right? So here's my soil way down here, 5.2. Look at how little of these nutrients get taken up. I guess you're probably not seeing my pointer. But if you look between the 5 and the 5.5, and you can see how narrow the bands are for how much that's representing how available those nutrients are. So even if I had gone out and spent all the money on all of these amendments, but not gotten the pH straightened out first, they'd basically all be wasted money, because the plants wouldn't be able to utilize it until I got my pH up, probably up into the 6.2 to 6.5 range.
And Bill, your pointer does seem to be working for at least some of us.
Oh, good. So, yeah, and as I mentioned, with legumes frost seeding, you can get away with putting on soil amendments after you put the seed down. Clover seed is pretty durable once it gets in the soil. It'll wait there until the conditions are right, and then it will germinate and grow. Some of the typical legumes that we use in pasture and hay, and the differences between them. White clover is a low-growing plant that has a creeping habit, so it will fill in gaps between grass plants, which is really nice from a soil health standpoint. It also, like all the legumes, it will increase the protein level of your feed. They tend to be a very high protein feed. And they also, all of the legumes, once they're established, provide atmospheric nitrogen in order to actually improve grass growth. A good stand of clover in your grass-based pasture, you can produce enough nitrogen just from the clover to feed all of the needs of the grasses. So Ladino is a white clover that's specifically selected to have larger leaves, so it competes better. It's still a white clover, but it's represented here in the second plant. You can see it's taller. It has a deeper taproot than your basic white clover. And it has much larger leaves, so bigger solar panels. So it does a better job of thriving in the shade. I meant to say this at the beginning. If you've got questions as I go along, feel free to just shout them out. I don't need to have you guys wait until I'm all done before I take questions. I can't see if people put their hands up or anything like that, so just take yourself off mute and shout out your question, and I'll try to answer it. Alfalfa, as I mentioned before, performs fairly poorly in frost seeding. There tends to be a lot of the seed lost, either to rot or it just doesn't germinate well. And this is a photograph of a white clover plant, just to show that stolon, it's called. This horizontal stem grows right along the ground. Out here at the edge on the right-hand side of the screen, that's the growth point of this plant. Now that's always going to be right at the ground level or very close to it, like within half an inch of the ground. So it's pretty unlikely that your animals are going to, well, we certainly hope that your animals are not ever going to graze that growth point off, because they shouldn't be grazing that close to the ground anyway. So this is a plant that handles managed grazing really well, because your animals are going to eat that leaf. Somebody's already eaten these two leaves off of it, but they're not going to mess up the stem, and they're not going to mess up the growth point. And this is just going to keep creeping around in your pasture. It's going to set down a little root at every node, every place where a group of leaves goes off of the stolon. There's also going to be a formation of a little root. So that's going to help with water infiltration and soil stability. I just love this plant. You can probably tell I'm just like completely enamored with it. It's extremely palatable, tolerates grazing better than most other legumes, as I mentioned. In fairness, red clover is higher yielding than white, and it has that upright growth habit. And it's a better choice if you're making hay on this pasture as well as grazing it. It's much easier to dry than white clover. And it's super vigorous. It's really easy to establish. So it gains some points that way. I'm not down on it at all. I'm just not as in love with it as I am with white clover. So then I wanted to talk a little bit more about timing. The ideal time for frost seeding is when the snow is gone and the frost is coming out of the ground. And you can see this guy's got a broadcast seeder on the back of his ATV, and he's just going to be driving up and down this field broadcasting. And this looks like it's probably some sort of worked over ground, a stubble field as opposed to a pasture, but the the concept is the same. And this photograph shows an even lower tech seeding method of a hand cranked broadcast seeder with a shoulder mounted bag. This guy's spreading seed onto snow, which you can do, but you need to really bump up the seeding rate because birds are going to get your seed, and a lot of your seed's not going to ever make it into the ground to germinate. And that's kind of the broad overview. I'm happy to take any questions or elaborate on any of the points if people would like.
Bill, ideally, how much stubble do you want out there when you're frost seeding? Like, is it better to have a field that you closely grazed in the fall, or one that has a lot of stover left in it?
It would be anything you can do to increase the amount of seed that gets actually onto the soil is going to help your stand germinate better. So a heavily or closely grazed field is probably the best, where you're going to get the best catch. If you don't have that, there's no reason not to frost seed. But again, you might just need to bump your seeding rates up. And the thing to bear in mind is that the seeding rates on these clovers are pretty low. As a pure stand, or rather in a mix that's being tilled into the soil, Ladino clover goes on at about 2 pounds per acre, and red clover goes on at about 4. And I would suggest for any frost seeding application that you probably want to increase that to like 1.5 times the normal rate for a mixture seeding. So 3 pounds and 6. And then as you start to have conditions, the more conditions you have that will impede the soil getting into contact with the seed, such as snow, such as remaining pasture, the more you need to bump that up. So you could end up as high as 4 pounds an acre for white clover and 8 pounds an acre for red clover. And I know people that just start there. They just say, that's how much I'm going to put on. And that's fine until you start to see what seed costs this year. Seed costs this year are insane. And there's a lot of stuff that isn't available. Certified organic red clover is unavailable, from what I understand, anywhere in the United States.
Hi, this is Brent and Carrie, Willow Pond Sheep Farm, and wanted to ask you what your experience is frost seeding chicory. Is that something that you've had success with or thought about doing?
I did a trample seeding, similar time frame of a mix that had some chicory in it. And it did actually take pretty well. Again, it's one of those small seeded annual, or not annuals, but perennials. And yeah, that's a one-off example, but it did work. But that was into almost bare soil with sheep being fed out on this bare soil with seeds spun onto it before they went on, and I put hay out for them to eat, and then, they basically walk the seed into the soil.
I know that for our bird's foot trefoil trials, we did some frost seeding there. But being that it's bird's foot trefoil, which has a lot of trouble getting started anyway, we were going very high with the amount of seed, which given the price of bird's foot trefoil seed this year would be very, very expensive. But we were going more like at 17 pounds per acre
Yeah,
with our frost seeding. One thing that I did find interesting is we had a couple of farms that frost seeded into their control areas for our last set of studies of clovers, and then into the bird's foot areas, bird's foot, and yet they were really convinced that they had more clover out there than they did bird's foot. But when we did the biomass sampling, there was actually pretty much the same amount of both, but I didn't ask them what ratios they did of the clover. And what was clear is they were seeing the bigger clover
yeah,
leaves than the bird's foot leaves, so it made them feel like there was more out there.
yeah,
But I also think that the bird's foot was planted at a heavier rate. We also tried to frost seed in some sandpoint seed, and none of them appeared to have been successful with it. But I was really surprised with the sandpoint seed. And one, it likes a more alkaline soil, so it doesn't really work in our area that well anyway. But the seed is also a lot like a parsley seed or a carrot seed. It's a very light seed.
uh-huh,
So I know a couple of our farmers like Ben Wood, who couldn't be here because he's in the middle of lambing right now. He looked at the seed and said, no, I'm going to save this and try and mud seed it or trample it in or do a traditional tillage with it. I'm not going to try and frost seed. I know that West Virginia, the organic sheep farm at the university there, said that they were successful frost seeding their sandpoint seed, but I don't know what kind of soil type they had, because for us, it just really looked like it would just not go, not try and get down into those crevices. That it was just light and wide a seed.
yeah. And bird's foot trefoil, I mean, it always wants a heavier seeding rate than either of the clovers. And as you're saying, it's very slow to get established. It's a great legume, and if you get the creeping type, not the hay type, but the pasture type, it will, similarly to white clover, it will fill in those gaps between bunch grasses, or if you have bare spots for whatever reason, it will find those and establish in those areas. I have one client who has a field of warm seed as in native grasses, so it's like big blue stem and some switchgrass, and on a like a percentage basis, there's probably 50% bare soil in that field. So I suggested that he try some bird's foot trefoil. Bird's foot will tolerate a little bit more acidic conditions than the clovers will. And the warm season natives were bred, because they're native to our northeastern soils, they don't want they don't want soils that are as close or to neutral as some of the other pasture grasses. So it seemed like a good fit, and it worked pretty well. He did frost seed it. And fortunately for him, he did it before the seed prices went absolutely through the roof. So it will work. And that was on a fine sandy loam soil, our state soil called Marlow, which the sand component of it is so fine it's almost like a silt. So it does have a lot of frost action to it. So it worked pretty well. I was pretty pleased with it, and it also gives the animals some a little bit of a protein boost, because you generally are grazing those warm season annuals at a time of the year when they're themselves fairly low in protein. I'm sorry, warm season perennials, warm season native grasses.
I have a question about varieties. We got a copy of the King's Agri-Seed catalog, and we're looking through it, and we chose to get the Alice white clover, but they have 5 or 6 different options. And do you have any opinions about the different cultivars available?
I've certainly planted a lot of Alice. It's been around quite some time. It's good. There's not a lot of surprises with it. I think it'll do fine for you. I get a little bit nervous with some of the super spiffy new ones where they're kind of pushing the outer edges of some of the breeding parameters, looking for kind of the higher ends of certain traits, leaf size, or things that that when you read the brochure, it might sound like this would be great, but those things almost always come at a cost. And for frost seeding, you really just, the main thing you need is a variety that's going to be tolerant of kind of abusive conditions, right? You're not giving it the very best seed bed that money can buy. You're giving it what you what you hope it will be happy with. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to say that I think Alice is a great choice. There was a Ladino that came out of the University of North Carolina back in the 90s called Will, W-I-L-L. And I love that, and I can't seem to find it anymore. So I don't know if it had if it lacked disease resistance, or just whoever was breeding it got sick of doing it, or what, but it had I think a little bit bigger leaf than Alice. So there's my contact info, and my colleague Jessie Wright, her contact info if you have questions that come up later and you want to get in touch with one of us. If you're in New Hampshire, that's our primary work area. We can really provide a quite detailed level of technical assistance for you. If you're not from New Hampshire, I'll have a nice chat with you, but I won't be able to come to your farm and help you interpret soil tests and all that kind of stuff. So thank you all very much for your time and attention, and I'll turn it back over to Nico once I figure out how to stop my screen sharing.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Bill. I'm going to stop the recording at this point.
Or Nico,
Yeah.
it's fine to keep the recording going during the discussion that's sort of related to his quest to
Okay.
Bill's topics. But if you think we're branching off of that, then that might be the time to stop it.
Okay, well, let's see. Does anyone else have any question or any contributions, comments, maybe experiences on your own farm with frost seeding that you would like to share? Who does frost seeding? Who does maybe pasture renovations in general, who has experience with that and would like to share that?
I know that Don is on, I think Don was on, and I don't know if he had any thoughts on for Western New York, what sort of clovers he would recommend and stuff for planting. And I think that Jim Taylor maybe has some experience with frost seeding. I know Ben Wood does, but as I said, I know that he's in the middle of lambing tonight.
Don, I saw you starting to talk, but you were muted. Lower left-hand corner of your screen, probably a picture of a microphone.
How's that? That work?
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Yeah. We like the tall white clovers, some of the ladinos you mentioned. And also there's one variety we use quite a bit is Alice in our pasture situations. Medium red and some of the other red clovers, different varieties, is what we're using our hay mixes, hay/pastures, yes. Firstfoot trefoil is one variety I've been trying to bring back for several years now. 30, 40, 50 years ago, everything we did was burstfoot or alfalfa. And then we got away from it with our clovers. And I have several producers I'm working with really like the burstfoot. And the trouble is this year is quite expensive again. Something like $380 a bag for 50 pounds. And that's up about $100 more than what it has been in the past. So just last year or so.
Yeah, when
One thing
King
you didn't
starts selling it
mention
in 5-pound bags, you know it's expensive.
One thing you didn't mention, Bill, is the seed cost. Most of our grasses are way high this year.
Yeah,
There's a severe drought out in Oregon last year, and it's just driven the prices up ridiculously high.
I just got a quote on meadow fescue at $350 a bag. I'm sorry, Don, I talked over you there.
Yeah. No, some different varieties of Timothy and so forth, the total loss. No seed production at all last year.
Yeah. So the lesson there is that if you want to do a frost seeding this spring, don't think you're going to necessarily be able to wait until, you know, late February, early March to get your seed. Get it now if you can get it.
Well, get it ordered, so
yeah.
it's reserved for you.
Yeah.
So there is a question in the chat box. Are there any common pasture species that do not do well with frost seeding? Is there anything that does not take to that well?
I would say most of the grasses don't do super well with it. Sometimes you get lucky. They'll do better with trample seeding, but they tend not to get, you know, just because of their physical shape and size and weight, they tend to not get down to the soil if there's anything there to impede them. Sort of along the lines of what Tatiana was saying about Sanfoin, that they're just, you know, a little bit too light. The other thing I feel remiss for not mentioning, any of the legume seeds, if you really want to capitalize on their ability to produce nitrogen from through fixation, atmospheric fixation, you need to have the seed inoculated with the species-specific rhizobium bacteria, which often comes as a coating on the legume seed. But if it doesn't, you need to purchase that and get it onto that seed before you spread it. Because if you don't have that, and if it isn't present in your soil already, which a lot of times it is, but you don't know for sure until later. But it's better to put it there, and then you know that you're clover has everything that it needs to take the atmospheric nitrogen and put it into the soil in a plant available format. And there's
Bill,
a
would you mind-
different one for each legume. It isn't just, you can't just buy the clover one, you have to buy the white clover one, and you have to buy the red clover one.
Do you have any practical tips on how to best mixing that with the seed? Because I remember a couple of years ago that was actually quite labor intense and a little bit complicated.
is.
Maybe you have.
It is labor intensive and complicated if you don't. So there's two schools of thought. One is to never buy the pre-inoculated seed because who knows how it's been handled and whether it's still viable or not. And the other is to always buy it because it's such a pain in the neck to try to inoculate it yourself. The best way that I've been told to inoculate clover seed or any legume seed is to spread it out in a thin layer on a tarp or something like that, and lightly mist it with with like a spray bottle, squirt bottle, with some sugar water, and then sprinkle the inoculant dust over it, and then sort of mix it all together and let it dry out. So yeah, it's pretty labor intensive. I also know people that have just taken the inoculant and just dumped it into the bag and shook it up real good. I don't know how effective that is. It's certainly less labor intensive. I don't know if there's any research to support, how fussy you have to be with getting that on, but obviously if it's, they've definitely done research that shows that if you don't put it on, you get less atmospheric nitrogen fixation.
Are there any concerns with the type of terrain that you're doing your frost seeding on? I have a tendency to run my goats on pretty hilly terrain. And so outside of the pH of the soil and, good timing and choosing the right varieties, are there any concerns when you're on hillier terrain?
Well, I guess the only concern that comes to my mind would be the safety of operating equipment if you're doing it with an ATV or a tractor. If you're doing it with that, shoulder mounted broadcast seeder, if you can walk on it, you can seed on it. I don't think it would matter too much how hilly it is, actually. I frost seeded on some 18 to 20% slopes, which are pretty steep.
Yeah, that sounds like something that I would be considering doing on, the kind of thing that would make a nice sledding hill.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think you would want to really consider what the wind is doing when you're on a hillier terrain. Because if you're broadcast seeding, the wind can really make a difference on where that seed's ending up.
That's a great point. The hilly areas tend to either catch the wind or, make it silent. And that can change based on what time of year it is. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah. And that's going to be true even on flat ground as well. I mean, it sort of depends on how fussy you are about how much coverage you want. Like if you want absolutely perfect coverage, you need to do this when the wind is pretty calm as well, because it will affect how much how the broadcast seeder spreads.
I think too, one thing, if you get pre-inoculated seed, it's already been scarified a little when they go to put the inoculant on it. And so the thing to remember, if you're going to inoculate your own seed and you want to scarify the seed at all, like you're going to run it through a little cement mixer or something, to rough up that seed in case there's a lot of hard seed in that seed lot, you're going to want to do that before you put your inoculant on. And also, it won't be necessary to do that if you're buying pre-inoculated seed.
I love hard seed because it just sits there forever. I mean, I'm actually advising more and more of my clients now, and particularly if it's a pasture renovation, before you spend money on seed, especially with it being so crazy expensive right now, let's put down the lime, get the pH right. Let's, if there's a fertilizer deficit, like particularly potassium is usually an issue in our part of the world. Let's square that away. Then let's wait a year and see what happens. I would say 75% of the time, you get a big flush of white clover, because the white clover is there sitting in the ground. Hard seed's been there for 100 years or more in some of these fields, and it's just waiting for the right conditions. And as soon as you get that pH squared away and give it enough potassium, sometimes on my fields, because they had been mined by a haying operation, I needed a lot of phosphorus as well. That's not a particularly common situation, but you get those issues squared away, and the clover often is already there. And I guess that's another thing about frost seeding, like any form of no-till seeding. You're not necessarily going to see the results instantly, but you will see them. It just might take longer than if you're used to turning a field over and running the Brilliant seeder up and down it, and then 10 days later seeing a fuzz of green across the whole field and saying, there, I did it. You won't get that feeling with frost seeding or with any kind of no-till, really. It'll take some time.
Okay, a couple comments I have here, Bill, is your native clovers in your soil. Most of those, at least in our area, are the Dutch white clover, the real short stuff. You'll find that in your lawn area and every other place. Not really anything that, being close grazers, our sheep could get those, but other forms of livestock, like our cattle and everything, would not be able to reach most of those. The thing on seed, inoculant, legumes, I strongly encourage producers to go with the coated seed and with the coating that is sprayed on the seed. And I had the opportunity to be out in Barrenbrug, out in Oregon here 3-4 years ago, and witness this. They're spraying the coating on the seed in their equipment, and different colors that they have patents on, believe it or not, particularly the yellow coating on Barrenbrug. That's patented. No other seed company can use the yellow coating, but that coating not only has the inoculant in it, but also has the ability to absorb moisture in the soil and to increase the germination rate. Yes, with the coating, you got less seeds per pound because the coating has some weight to it also. So like our clovers, instead of 800,000 seeds in a pound, there might only be 640,000 seeds. But with the coating absorbing the moisture, increasing germination rate, you get a much better stand. And some of our clovers, like you're talking about a lot of our white clovers, seeding rate no more than 2.5 pounds the acre. And or else you're going to have just solid clovers. A lot of our improved red clovers, a lot of those were going 4 or 5 pounds the acre. The medium red clover is still a standby for a lot of people. Yeah, we're still going 8 to 10 pounds the acre on that. So again, with the new improved clovers and with the coatings, we can drastically reduce our seeding rates and still have an excellent stand. The forages out there and the new improved clovers, been out here now a number of years now. Again, longevity is built into those, bred into those different varieties. So we can have something that's going to last for, I know I got some hay fields with some red clovers in it. 7, 8 years ago, I seeded those fields, and still good amount of clover still in that field. So
Yep, and I don't disagree with anything you're saying. It's always just a question of, you know, particularly in a year when seed's going to be real pricey, you know, maybe the Dutch white clover is better than nothing. And I mean, I do see some of the taller white clovers and some red clovers coming in just from fertility and management improvement in some places, but you're right, it is mostly that shorter Dutch white.
My dogs aren't cooperating, but Nico, could you maybe read what Jim Taylor has put in the chat? Where he's talking about, well, actually, I guess I can read it if my dogs stay quiet. But he's talking about having had poor results with frost seeding because the high level of thatch we usually have in our fields. So we've moved to using a no-till drill to put the seed in the ground at opportune times for better results. With our drill, we can reduce the rates and get excellent results. Are there other people who are doing no-till?
Yeah, no-till.
Myself, I'm not using no-till, but I am consulting with a lot of producers that have used it in the past and are planning to use it this year. The caution I always throw out about no-till drills, you watch how close or how deep that drill is going. It may be set up for a 1/4 inch deep, which is the maximum we want to go on most of our forages as far as planting depth. We're not planting oats, which is, you know, 1.5 to 2 inches. But anyways, a 1/4 inch is our limit. And once we set that drill up, we need to constantly check the seeding depth. When these two drills first came out 20, 25 years ago, several of us were, spending, wearing out the knees on our jeans, crawling around the fields, checking for depth on these drills. I would rather see a no-till drill drop the seed on the surface and the packer wheel push it in the soil or on the top of the soil. And as you said, Bill, soil seed contact, very critical. And I rather see the seed just pushed on the surface than be, planted too deep.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of failures with no-till drills. So I do caution people on them. They're a good tool, but let's not misuse them.
Yeah. Yeah. You just have to be, they're tricky to set up. And my experience with them is that they don't stay set up. You need to, every few acres, you need to be checking to make sure that they haven't started to run deep on you. That said, I recently come off of a 10-year stint or 9-year stint as a conservation district supervisor, and we initiated a no-till drill rental program, and the district now owns 2 of them that they rent to farmers. One's an 8-footer and one's a 12-footer. And we do a lot of cover crop acreage with the big one, but we've started to see a lot more interest with it in pasture planting. And again, if we can get that set up right, it's I would say it's every bit as effective as a brilliant on tilled ground, except for that it takes more time for it to fill in because you're only planting, a row of seed every 7 inches as opposed to every, whatever a brilliant does, 1/2 inch or whatever. So they can be really good. They can also, like you say, they can bury it so far down that it doesn't have a chance.
I know that for our birds foot trefoil study that we just ended, a lot of, it was only 4 farms, but several of them had planned on no-till seeding. But one of them found very few of the NRC places had them for rent anymore. And we found that often the small farms we were working with couldn't qualify to their liability insurance or their vehicles they had for bringing the no-till seeder to their house, to their farms. And then there were problems with they had to predict what days they were going to use it. And so that was problematic. And then some of them were planning to use have a neighbor bring the no-till seeder over. But because of how hard some of the planning conditions were in 2020 and 2019, it would work out that by the time they could get into the field, the person who was going to no-till seed was already planting. So only one of the 4 farms was actually able to no-till seed, but did get some nice reactions, so it is an option, definitely.
Yeah. I know here in New Hampshire, and I believe in Vermont, more and more of the conservation districts are getting some of this equipment rental business going. And you identified a lot of the challenges with it, that, you're using a piece of shared equipment, and it's all scheduled out, months in advance. And so you can't always get it exactly when you need it, and you can't always use it exactly when you get it. So there are some problems with it. It also tends to be used by people that don't have a lot of experience with equipment, so sometimes it gets kind of beat up. And anyway, there are some drawbacks to it. The big plus for the rental programs is that, these drills cost anywhere from, 25,000 to, the sky's the limit, I guess. And if you only have to use it a couple of days every 10 years, it's kind of hard to justify owning that piece of equipment. It'd be nice to just find somebody you could hire to run it for you. But so here in New Hampshire, we do have a small drill that one of the districts has. It's actually like almost a glorified feed plot deer hunter's rig, 6 foot wide Casco no-till drill that originally the grazing group bought, and we did some modifications on it. We put some different coulters on. We did a few things to sort of improve the the amount of surface area that seed got dropped into and then rolled into, and it works pretty well. But again, it's one machine for a whole state. It doesn't fill the need. And at only 6 feet wide, it takes forever to go, any sort of distance with it.
Bill, can you describe what you mean by trampling seeding a little more? And is it pretty similar to what mud seeding would be? Because I know we did some one of our farmers, Dave Belding, did some pretty successful mud seeding with the birds, but
well, we may be talking about the same thing and not having heard each other's term for it. Because I've never really heard the term mud seeding, but it sounds a lot like what I'm describing. So, basically with trample seeding, you're putting seed down onto disturbed soil with animals on it to kind of walk the seed into the soil. I've done it in sort of winter feeding areas that had a lot of bare ground, and they did tend to be a little bit muddy. I don't like to keep my animals in muddy places very long, if at all. So anyways, you know, you need to have a certain amount of animal pressure in order to accomplish getting the seed in, but you also don't want to have so much animal pressure that you bury the seed too deep. And I think this is a type of seeding that I feel anyways, it works a lot better with sheep and goats than it does with cattle, because cattle can just push they create such a muck hole. Seed tends to be down too far. Does that sound like what you're calling mud seeding?
Yeah, it sounds very similar. I mean, basically, the situation we were in, failed to be able to plant 2 years in a row. And so the farmer was getting pretty desperate as far as we'd gotten some of the acreage done, but he'd had 2 years of drought, being too wet early in the spring and then a drought the rest of the year. And so this year, I guess this was 2021, it was looking again like it was going to be too wet. You know, so this was up in the North Country, but maybe a Thousand Island area, but maybe like in April. And so what he did was broadcast the seed, and then brought his I think he brought his cattle in for, he had grazed pretty short, and he brought the cattle in for a day and then kicked them out, or for a few hours and then kicked them out and put the seed down, and then ran the cattle in again for just an hour or two, and ran and the cattle just sort of went running back and forth. And then he brought and he did have goats available, but they were only in there for a couple of hours, and then he took them out. So I do have slides of it, that I can show at some point, or that'll be online. And like I say, he got as good a stand, a percentage biomass, in the fall as we had gotten the previous year for the acres we had been able to plant before the drought had hit. So he was pretty pleased with it, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like the same sort of concept. So, different, a little bit different details in the management, but same basic ideas.
Nico, do we want to turn off the recording if no one else has anything more on seeding and planting, and then just go to general topics?
Yep.
I've got one more comment on seeding, if you want to hear about it.
Go right ahead.
Okay, as far as new seedings and everything, always critical, regardless the species of livestock we're trying to graze, is make sure that new seeding is well rooted. I don't know, Bill, you might have alluded on that a little bit. But again, I always like to go out there, or tell my clients that go out there and grab a holder like the cattle do or the sheep do. If you're pulling the roots up, then you don't want to be grazing that. So again, give the seeding a chance to get established, rooted, and hopefully, and again, with fertility. If you're grazing a pasture consistently year after year, you're taking nutrients out of that and putting it in the milk or meat. And again, we're talking about top dressing. Your basic salt test will indicate your levels of phosphorus and potash and calcium and so forth. And again, replenishing those nutrients is very important to maintain a certain level of fertility in that field. So, and that's about the only comments I'll end with. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on it.